to be great, you have to sacrifice. You have to be selfish. You have to give up things in the moment. You have to give up immediate satisfaction, right? For delayed gratification. You have to be able to do that. And if you don't, then you're not going to be great. You might be good, but you won't be great.
Hey, it's Ben Wise, and this is The Fitness Movement. The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. Zor Fitness is my company and my platform to deliver training-related content to people just like you. The site features in-depth articles, movement breakdowns, and our online training program, The Protocol. And I offer one-on-one remote coaching for fitness athletes. So I hope you check it out. Head over to zorfitness.com. That's ZOAR fitness.com. See you there. Today we got Jason Leydon on the show. He is the owner of CrossFit Milford and Conquer Athlete, which is a remote coaching service. You can find him personally, Instagram at Jason Leydon, Leydon spelled Leydon, and Facebook at jason.leydon. If you're in Connecticut, check out CrossFitMilford.com, Instagram at CrossFit_Milford, Facebook at CrossFit Milford. And then for Conquer Athlete, you can check them out at conquerathlete.com and Instagram and Facebook at Conquer Athlete. So Jason and the other coaches at Conquer work with a lot of high-level athletes, games levels, and all the different divisions. And he's got a lot of great information to share. He's a really robust background. And we talk about that in the podcast. But we also talk about the pros and cons of remote coaching versus actually coaching in a class setting or doing some kind of personal training. We talk about how coaches can develop their toolbox without actually experimenting on their athletes, what their physiological testing looks like for Conquer for their higher level athletes. We also touch on the role of volume as a training quality, and then where we see the sport of fitness headed in the future. This is a fantastic episode. There's a lot of good information in it. So without further ado, let's jump into this conversation with Jason Leydon. So Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me, Ben.
Yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation. You're someone I respect a lot in the space because you've got both a remote and in-person coaching business. I commend you a lot for, taking on both of those.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cannot be easy. You're a busy man.
Yeah. There's definitely ebbs and flows in the year, with both, whether it's from busy times of trying to grow the brick and mortar the right way and adjust things and make planning situations happen, or, from a remote programming standpoint, flows of the year with different athletes and structuring all that stuff. So yeah, it can get there. It can get busy.
Yeah, no doubt. So starting off here, you've had an athletic career yourself, playing basketball, competitive CrossFit, getting to a high level there. Basically like overall just seeking to have the best performance you can on game day. Like, how do you feel like your own personal athletic career has helped you to be able to coach high level athletes?
A lot. And I say a lot because growing up, I was good, but I wasn't like the most athletically gifted person playing. You know how when you play some sports, you got guys that will come out there, it's like, if it's baseball, they just see the ball and they have a beautiful natural swing and they're super quick and can read the ball, come to bat. And if basketball, you got the guys that just are built perfectly and have the 40-inch vert and are super quick. Like the guys just are great and the women that are great. And I was good, right, where my sport is basketball, and athletically I had in college a 35-inch vert, and I just had my vertically tested again 2 weeks ago, and at the age of 41 it was still at 30 inches, so I was pretty happy about that, but so it was up there, but it wasn't like 40-inch vert, and I was quick and fast, but I wasn't the quickest and fastest. So
right,
from a sport perspective, for me to achieve my goals, whether it was my goals in 7th, 8th grade, or my goals in high school or college, or eventually trying to get overseas, the one thing I had to rely on was work ethic. And I really had to make sure that I was able to work harder than everybody else. And in the college level, something that really shined a light on me, unfortunately, when I was done. So I was in college for 5 years, and it's kind of like that 5th year as I was getting ready to get to agency tryouts, the idea of mental resiliency and toughness kind of came into play, because when I was growing up playing basketball, I was a head case. I was a fucking head case. And if I had a bad game or I missed a couple of shots, I would be in the tank, you know? And it took a lot for me to come back from that. So finally, I started working with some more coaches, and we started focusing on that before I ended up going overseas. But the work ethic that I had to develop in order to achieve my goals, I think, is one of the biggest carryovers for me as being a coach, because I understand what it takes to sacrifice, and I understand what it takes to not be the best, but have to work harder than everybody else, and what that means, you know? So when I work with athletes, I can have that real conversation with them about hard work and sacrifice, because I did it, you know, and I did it for I didn't do it for a 6-year CrossFit stint, right? I did it for 25 years of my life, starting in 6th grade. And I had to sacrifice a lot of things, from family to friendships to girlfriends to pretty much everything. And so I got it and I get it. So that's probably helped me the most in my coaching career, is that carryover from my sporting career.
Yeah, I think maybe as a coach, it's easier to ask someone to sacrifice other areas of their life if you've personally done that before and you understand what that should look like.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100% agree. And then when they don't do it, I'm like, all right, well, you just don't want to be as good as you think you do. Because everything, to be great, you have to sacrifice. You have to be selfish. You have to give up things in the moment. You have to give up immediate satisfaction, right, for delayed gratification. You have to be able to do that. And if you don't, then you're not going to be great. You might be good, but you won't be great.
Right. To be in the very top echelon of the sport, you have to do all the stuff that no one else is willing to do, which is cut all the other stuff away.
Yeah, because the people at the top, they're doing it, right? They're doing it, the people at the top. And because to get to the top, your athletic ability and your talents, it's only going to get you so far. Once you get to a certain level, everybody has that, you know, everybody has it. So yeah, you got to be willing to do the other stuff.
Yeah. Is the hard work or work ethic, or, you know, thinking about trying to basically optimize your entire life around something, is that something that's easier to do as an in-person coach, or do you think that's also totally doable as a remote coach?
You mean as far as making sure athletes are doing it?
Not necessarily adherence, but just you know, so I think oftentimes if you're an in-person coach, you can see the person, look into their eyes and be able to see all right, this, you know, the person's energy is good today or whatever. And you can get a much better feel for immediate feedback. The feedback loop is so much shorter in-person coaching. Whereas if it's remote coaching, you know, it's really hard to know sometimes if someone's sort of beat up a little bit, or how to push them, how to help them grow as a person. I mean, you could maybe do that through video calls and stuff like that, but is there other ways through communication that you feel you help athletes develop those more soft skills?
That's a great question, because I think that's the question that I get asked the most, and it's probably the question I think about the most, because you have two types of athletes. Well, not two, but the two main ones that I see. You have the athlete who, you know, the person who feels like they have to give you the right feedback and do everything you say, or else they feel like they're letting you down, right? So either they're tired, you're like, hey, how you feeling today? They go, I feel great, even though they might not be, right?
Right.
And then you have another type of athlete who might be too sensitive to different feelings in their body. And I've had games athletes like this as well, where you're like, my shoulders, you know, a little bit off. I got to back off today. I'm like, all right, well, you do CrossFit, your shoulder's probably going to be off for 6 months out of the year, right? To an extent, right? You know what I mean? But and you have those athletes too. And for both those athletes, it's really hard to peel away the superficial language to understand what's really happening with them from a virtual standpoint. And I think the biggest way to really go about that is developing over time, the trust. And, you know, true leadership comes from really two things. It's trust and it's results. If the athlete trusts you, then they'll follow you. And if you get results, they'll follow you. And if an athlete really trusts you, and the lines of communication are open in a way that they feel comfortable with explaining to you emotions or feelings, and they know that the feedback you give them is the appropriate and right feedback for them based off the results you've given them, then I think that opens up a new door for coaches from a virtual standpoint to be able to really assess their athletes in a better way, because that's the hardest thing to do, right? In the virtual world, is to truly assess them. Like you said, in person, the feedback loop is so quick, right? You can look in their eyes, you can see how they shake your hand, you can assess their body language, you can assess their voice projection. Did they yawn when they walk in? I mean, there's so many feedback. There's so many levels of feedback you can get instantaneous when working with somebody in person. Virtual, it's really hard to do. So they got to have that trust in you as a coach and the trust in you as a leader for them to be able to give you feedback, knowing that you're going to give them the best response to their feedback for what's going to lead them to success and results. So yeah, I think that really comes down to this just constant growing of trust.
Mm-hmm. I think there's, two ways that I personally think about doing this. Is like, number one, if you listen to their feedback where, just because they say they're a little run down doesn't mean you're like, oh, we have to instantly deload you. And like sometimes athletes, I think, kind of shelter a little bit of like their thoughts or emotions or whatever, just because like they don't necessarily trust like your decision-making process as their coach yet. So like one of the things, if you're appropriately giving them, actually listening to their feedback, but making sure the training decisions you make off that, are really what they actually need in that given moment, which isn't always an easy thing to do. But then the other thing that I personally try to do is like in the first maybe cycle I have that athlete, in the first like 6 to 8 weeks, maybe, we're going to pick 2 things and I'm going to make sure 100% that you get better at those 2 things so that we've got some additional buy-in moving forward. Because like I've already proven to myself as your coach, like now we can make sure that you are actually getting better, like measurably at these things. And it's like, I think if you can show, like you were saying, like build on those small wins so that the athlete buy-in goes up over time.
100%. Yeah. And I think those are the 2 things that coaches have to really focus on is trust and results, because if you get results, then they're going to trust you. And if they have the trust that you're going to give them the right stuff to be successful in the moment and based on how they're feeling what's happening, then they're going to give you the right feedback. And they're going to know that what you're going to say back to them or tell them to do is the right thing, but that takes time, right? And it takes time, and different athletes need different forms of communication to build that trust and to have that confidence in your leadership.
Totally. I don't think there's any way to fast track that.
Yeah, no, there's not. I mean, sometimes, if you have a lot of results and a lot of progress, then they might come in right away, just listen and do whatever you say and do. But if it doesn't yield them results, then it will quickly be lost, so.
Right. If you have an excellent reputation as a coach, for example, someone comes to you, you've been around the space for, a decade, you're already at a certain level. Whereas if like, they don't know who you are, they just came to you, like they walked into your gym, they're trying to figure out what's going on. Like if they don't have that background knowledge, if they haven't heard you speak on a bunch of stuff or whatever, yeah, they probably are that process of buy-in is going to take a little bit longer. Whereas if somebody already knows you and sort of like a hot lead, so to speak, yeah, it's going to go a little bit better.
Yeah. What's funny is, as you're saying that, it got me thinking, I have people in my gym, new members, I have to almost prove to them, like, I know what I'm doing versus my online class, because people that come into the gym, I don't coach a lot of classes now. I've kind of gone back to doing mostly some training clients, and then between the personal training and growing the businesses, my ability to coach classes diminishes dramatically every single year. And on top of that, my family. So I don't want to be here, after 4 p.m., right? Especially because my kids are 8 and 10 and they're playing every sport under the sun. So I want to be there with them, right? So when new members come in, I go to kind of fix them. I almost get this like feeling and sense from them that I have to kind of prove to them I know what I'm talking about, because they don't know who the fuck I am, right? They're like, oh, he's just the dude that owns it, who sits in his office all day long and occasionally comes out from time to time, right? It's like, so yeah, I have to kind of keep working on that with the brick and mortar side of things as well.
Yeah, it's really funny. Yeah. I mean, that is so true though. Like if someone does it, if they just don't have any experience with you, you still have to build that trust. You don't get to, skip any steps. It's kind of interesting. So sticking on the remote coaching thing, are there maybe certain athletes that you think should not be coached remotely?
Hey, you're coming at me with the good questions. I do. I think there are some athletes who thrive inside of a closer connection with a coach. They thrive with having an on-site coach to talk to daily. Like I have one athlete who I work with now who is a very high-level athlete who's one of those where it's almost like their form of communication is almost like this daily like assurance from me, or kind of like being around me, or and I don't mean just me, but their coach, And I think those athletes who need that, there's nothing wrong with that, but there's someone that's going to do better with having someone who's around them, someone to kind of see on a day-to-day scale basis what's happening. I think athletes that do better in a group, because there are some athletes that do better with inside of a group, in a group environment, I think they're going to thrive more with having that environment in person, that in-person environment for them, 100%. There's some athletes who are great and they're thrive whether they're alone or virtually. So I think they do better with that. So I guess I'd kind of lean to those two situations. Obviously, I think the people who are beginners will do better with an on-site sort of coach. And that might not mean the person is doing the exact coaching or programming if they're not developed yet, but people who are beginners, they need the hands-on work. They need to have a coach there who can understand how to communicate with them more efficiently to move well, right? Before they kind of start trying to jump up and jump levels or jump stages with inside their fitness capacities. So I guess I keep it to kind of those three areas.
Yeah.
What about you? What do you think?
I totally agree. I think beginners that's tough. Like, again, the feedback loop's really long. So if you're writing a program for them 1 week, they complete it, at the beginning of the next week is, by the end of the week is when they actually get their feedback or whatever. It's just a long process. If like, it's so nice to have, like maybe not a personal training environment, but like even like a coach, like a class atmosphere where you have a coach on the floor who can watch you and be like, okay, that rep you were forward, this rep was good. That one you're a little bit behind, a little bit or slow or whatever, like the sequencing, because there's so much variation and they often can't like feel it or they don't recognize it. Whereas like a more of a experienced or expert athlete is like, they have just so many reps under their belt. They're like, their mistakes are pretty consistent. Like every time I miss a snatch is out in front. And I know it's because I jumped my feet 3 inches back this time or whatever. Like they know that. So you can give them some cues and, it's more about program design and, long-term change than it is like rep over rep what's changing.
Yeah, man, not to cut you off, but yeah, we can kind of go down so many different paths on this one, because if someone comes in with a true, even if they are a beginner and they want a true set pathway for fitness or for a sport, and they're at a facility that doesn't offer that, right? And they just do like these big group GPP style classes. And then, yeah, even if they are a beginner, they're going to need a set path. Otherwise, they're going to be jumping stages from a developmental standpoint, and it's not by intention or purpose, just because they're following a different path than what they should be on. So, yeah, I feel like there's lots of levels to that question. Yeah. And I think the more that people understand what their path is and where they want to be in the environment they're in, then I think they can better answer that for themselves. Because if they do have a set destination of where they want to be, and the environment that they're in doesn't really outline the journey for them, then even if they are a beginner, they're going to need a virtual coach that can outline that program for them. But if they're a beginner and they're in an environment that can provide the journey and the guide that they need, then they'll probably do better with having that in-person guide.
Yeah, true. I mean, yeah, totally. Like if there's some in-person, atmospheres, whether it's PT group classes, where like your development as a beginner athlete is going to be much quicker. And like that can interplay with your own personality. And there's, exact same things. Like there's certain online remote coaches who probably do an excellent job with beginners and doing like video analysis and all that kind of stuff and getting deep into the weeds on that. Yeah, really interesting. What you said with the more advanced athletes, I think is what the demographic you were talking about. But like basically what I interpreted as was like certain demographics or personality traits of elite athletes are going to be like they need more of to be able to thrive. They need more of a competitive environment or like a nurturing in-person environment versus other athletes maybe are a little bit more intrinsically motivated and like they're seeing their own personal progress over time and they're able to do that a little bit more maybe, on their own in a lot of the training sessions. Because in reality is a lot of the games athletes are, unless they're at like a facility that has a bunch of other games level athletes there, like you don't have, a lot of your day, you don't have somebody to train with. It's interesting.
Yeah. And I think that's another debate or discussion we can even get on, because you look, okay, let's phrase it. Let's look at other sports. And if you look at the Kobe Bryants or the Michael Jordan, Wayne Gretzky, Derek Jeter, like whoever you want to look at in any sport, you look at the best people, their environment probably, I would argue 70 to 80% of the time was just themselves and their coach.
Yeah.
Right. They're not going to the weight room with 5 other dudes on the team. They're not going to the gym to do their drills with 7 other people just for the sake of environment. It's like, no, those people, they're going to go in with their coach and do their sport specific drills, their weight training, probably by themselves, because they don't want to fall off of work ethic through conversations with being around too many people. Then yeah, they go out there, play some games with their friends and create that environment as needed. Right. And I think sometimes I see that right now almost getting lost inside of our culture, where they have all these camps popping up. And I think camps are great. If you can get 5 or 6 like-minded people in the same environment, cool. But I'm curious to see in the long term, from a training perspective, like, does that have an effect as well? Because yeah, like, you're training hard, you're working together, cool. But I still believe that if you're at that top level and you're trying to be the best or be in that top 1%, then what you're doing 80% of the week has to be specifically geared for you. It can't be, I don't think it could be some group templated plan, because you're going to be missing lots of proper stuff. Now, 20% of the week, yeah, sure. Fridays and Saturdays, you get with that camp with the group and people get after it together and have that competitive environment. And there's lots of learning from that, just like in any other sport, right? You learn about fatigue factors, you learn about different limiters you didn't think you had, you learn about your mental resiliency, you learn how to apply your fitness into a sport environment. Because like not the debate, but fitness we know is your VO2, your strength, your ability to do stuff, right? Conditioning is your ability to apply your fitness inside that sporting environment. So being around a group of people only adds to your conditioning and mental resiliency or mental fitness. But I don't think that everybody is getting better just because they're around each other if they're doing the same thing every single day. I still think if you're trying to be in that 1%, then probably 70, 80% of your week needs to be very individually specific. And if you look at any other sport out there, every top person, that's what it's like. Jerry Rice, he would finish practice, right? And then he would do his own shit for like 3 hours of just running drills and routes, because that's what he had to do to be better, right? And as you get more specific inside any sport, the more individualized a lot of the stuff has to become.
Yeah, I'm guessing at some point in the future there is going to be that hybrid that you just talked about, where it's like, yes, there's these camps or pockets of elite athletes who are all maybe going to the same facility to train sometimes, but then a lot of their training that they're doing on a, in terms of like their training volume within a week, maybe, at least half of that, for example, is in their own individual sessions where they can moderate intensity a little bit more. And it's not so much just like a sports session where it's like, a throwdown to go for your best time in like a tester sort of environment. So like,
right,
if they're in more of a building phase or off season stuff, or if it's just like more developmental and stimulative type work, it's a little bit different than if they're just going and throwing down and like, maybe it's the equivalent of like scrimmaging in like a team sport where it's like, that's the time to like go up against like your teammates and to like, practice things that you're doing and like kind of refine your game day skills. But if you're doing drills and shots and that sort of stuff, you're going to do that on your own time.
Right. Totally.
Yeah. One of the things that you mentioned was sort of a physiological quality of, the VO2 max. And I've heard you talk about this before. What physiological testing do you do for your athletes? So like not necessarily like Metcon testers or like, strength work or anything like that. But like in terms of, VO2 max or even like blood work and things like that, what metrics do you gather from your athletes?
If they have collecting data from athletes, I think is amazing, but there's roadblocks from the financials of it. So for the athletes that had the means, I'm a huge fan of just a pure VO2 max test to understand their aerobic threshold and the anaerobic threshold and what that max is. I love blood work. And I think anytime I hook athletes up to work with our nutritionist, one of the first things we always do is blood work, right? To get a good understanding of what those levels are. And I love allergy testing, whether it's the Dutch test or any of the tests out there. There's lots of different names, and I'm sorry for them eluding me right now, but those are sort of like the main ones for me. I don't really kind of go too much beyond sort of like food allergy sensitivities, blood work, VO2 max. The other stuff I find out a lot just from training, but I think anytime you get outside of that, whether you do like DEXA scans or any of that stuff, I think that's all fantastic as long as the athletes can get it done. I try to get as much stuff done as I can without adding more stressors to the person, right? So if I know like they're financially strapped or it's just going to be a pain in the ass to get it done, then I'm not going to do it unless I start seeing signs of something that's like, hey, stuff's not quite flowing well. I can see like we're on a path where I don't want to be on. Let's look at a few different tests that we can do in a way that you can get them done, or at least something that's feasible for you that can give us insight into what might be causing this,
Yeah, if it's like a health issue versus like a performance thing.
Yeah. If someone's like constantly smoked and dragging ass and appetite's changing, et cetera, all right, we'll look at the training to see if the volume loaded too much for them. And if it still doesn't get fixed, then we got to check out some blood work and see what's going on from there from a hormone perspective.
Yeah.
But yeah, I want to get all that stuff done. If it was an ideal world, they would come in and we'd get it all done, right?
Yeah.
All that shit, because I think it's needed. If you look at any athletes that are anywhere at the highest level, all that stuff gets done for a reason, and just the more information and have an athlete, the better you can prescribe, whether it's from nutrition to sleep to hydration to training to mindset,
right?
Everything.
So where do you typically have athletes get a VO2 tested at?
So I've been fortunate to, one of my really good friends who I went to college with, we were freshman year at Springfield College, Dr. Jamie Shear. So she is a naturopath, and she did her post-grad at Ohio State University with the football team, I think the basketball team there. So we were really good friends in college. And her husband, Isaiah, is a chiropractor. So probably about 8 years ago, we were doing lots of stuff on nutrition and naturopathic medicine to kind of help some athletes who were experiencing different fatigue or burnout syndromes. And I said, I want to just get these guys tested more. I was like, I wish I had a way of just doing just VO2 max testing. And then like a week later, Jamie and Isaiah called me up and they're like, hey, so we're just going to create a company called Extra Lab, and we're going to start doing VO2 max testing. Like, fucking sweet. Let's do it, right? So that's kind of where I get all my testing done. They're out in New York, and I think in Westchester now. And they either come up, and now they have the I always say it wrong, but the PNOE system. Yeah, before they had just a traditional VO2 max tester, and now they have that system. So that was cool. It's way more portable, easier to use. So they'll come up here, I'll send athletes down there, and
that's cool.
We'll just do the testing. Yeah.
Is there a specific erg that you use or prefer to use?
With CrossFit, everything.
Yeah.
With the new system, it's easier to use across the board. Like the old system where they had the mouthpiece and the hose that attached to this cardio coach. And that hose that attached to the system, like that was really hard to use on other stuff.
Right.
You know? With the PNOE system, it's a lot easier to use. So over the span of a couple months, I'm going to try to get people tested on everything from the rower to the assault bike, the biker, the skier, the runner, and just see, like, we know that, okay, like, yeah, like your VO2 max, like we get that. And across the board with inside different machines, it may be a little different, but it's not going to be like a huge drastic change, you know?
Yeah, that's actually was my next question. It was to see if it was different on like air runner or assault bike versus ski erg, because I would imagine that those two might be slightly higher than ski erg.
It might be different, but it's not going to be like, if you're, let's just say from a number standpoint, it's like a 47, right? For a VO2 max, it's not going to drop to like a 35. You know, it's not going to be a huge drastic change
right
on them. But it's just good to have a good understanding of if there is a slight difference, because that can give you an insight into potential limiters around that, you know, totally. And or limiters that you might have to build upon. So that's why I like using them across the board on different things.
Yeah. And likely if like, you know, this probably wouldn't be necessary for like a beginner intermediate athlete. And likely those are the people that would probably see a greater discrepancy on something like that anyway. Like if you're a high level CrossFit athlete, like you spent time on all of those ergs, like you're pretty well, you know, like it's not like your lower body's super well developed, like you were an ex-runner or something, and you know, your upper body can't use oxygen effectively. Like that's not going to happen in a high level CrossFit athlete. So it makes more sense that they're pretty even across the board.
Yeah. Plus like their movement's good. Like if you put someone new on it and they've never rode before, then it might be more of a drastic change. Just because, you know, if we look at it from an energy expenditure standpoint, you have to have skill and technique. And, you know, if you get on a rower and you don't know how to row and you're wasting so much energy just in the fact of being inefficient of movement, it might be different, but that's just a movement standpoint, right? That's not really a true result standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. I want to switch gears a little bit because I got you for limited time here. One of the things that I respect a lot about you is that you're always learning new information. And as a coach, obviously that's super important and no one's going to dispute that. One of the things that I think could maybe be potentially, I don't know, maybe dangerous is the word, is like you learn something new and right away, like you want to go and like experiment on your athlete. And like, I don't think a coach would call it that, but realistically, that's probably what's going on. Yeah, exactly. Like, you know, I learned this new protocol. I want to see if it, maybe not if it works, but I want to, you know, I want to do something with it because I learned about it. So I like go and use it on my athlete. And essentially what's going on is in reality is that you're experimenting on them. Because I think it's pretty natural, like when you learn something that like it goes through like this hype cycle of like, okay, you're obsessed with it for a little bit. And then eventually after a period of time, and that could vary how long that is, it gets kind of put into your toolbox at the appropriate spot where you know that it's there and that it's going to get used when it, you know, should be used. And there's times where it shouldn't be used as well. And that process, there's no real way to speed that up. How do you kind of prevent that hype cycle from you to basically be experimenting on your clients? How do you prevent that process from happening?
Yeah, that is a great question. And you kind of nailed it. Like it's experimentation, you know, and something that I talk about a lot is, and I think I first heard this from Andy Galpin when I did a podcast with him, is the problem nowadays isn't getting information. The problem nowadays is deciphering the information and making it applicable to you and what you're doing. And like, I know like when I was first coming up and going through and developing as a coach, and right, there's different levels as a coach, you know, and the first level as a coach is really just like your acquisition phase. We're just trying to gather all the information you possibly can and create this tool belt of tactics, of methods, of principles, of ideas. And then you have sort of like that technician phase where you think about how to apply it and you're experimenting or varying with different ways to do things. And then hopefully if you're able to get to it, it's sort of like that mastery phase. Now, some people never get to the mastery phase and they spend their whole time in technician phase, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And some people are able to get to a quote unquote, you know, mastery phase, right? Of whatever that may be. And when I was coming up, for me to gather information, I had to like spend a lot of time just reading books and diving into journals and studying, or I had to travel and spend a lot of money to go hear someone talk or to go hang out with them. Where nowadays it's getting easier and easier at the click of a button. You pretty much can figure out like anything you want, you know? So I do see that a lot of the coaches kind of experimenting with it. And it brings me back to a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, which says, "The man who grasps principles can successfully select his own methods." And to me, what that means is the problem with coaches experimenting with things that they learn is that they don't truly understand the principles of what they're trying to do, because they're learning like different methods. So-and-so teaches this new method on building capacity or increasing the threshold, or this new squat approach, whatever it might be, right? Like, oh, let's try that. That seems really fucking cool. And we're going to do that. And all right, well, that you're experimenting, thinking if it can work. And I think what coaches have to first do before they start diving into methods and trying to understand this squat method or this snatch method or this muscle up method or this handstand push-up method is understand the principle of what they're trying to do. Like, what are the principles of building strength? What's the principles of building capacity? What's the principles of building hypertrophy or power or whatever it might be? The more that they can grasp on the principles, the better they can apply the methods that they're learning for what they're trying to do in a less experimental way. And the biggest thing I say too is first understand the principles of stress, right? And really what happens to the body from stress, whether it's from adding a stimulus to develop strength or adding a stimulus to improve capacity. And then what happens with too much of a stimulus, too often or not enough of a stimulus, right? And the more that they can understand principles from stress, recovery, and adaptation, the more they can understand the principles of building just pure strength and building hypertrophy into strength, into power, principles of building capacity, the better they can apply the methods. Because if they only constantly just learn methods, then they're constantly tied to that method and they don't know what the fuck to do if something doesn't go right or doesn't work. But if they take their time first just to develop and understand a principle, then now is when they can really pull from the tool belt. Like, oh, all right, well, I'm trying to get this person stronger. I see we're kind of stagnating here. Okay, well, I can pull from this method and that method to try to figure out how to best adapt to the principle of what I'm trying to create. And if I were to go back in time for myself, like that's what I would tell myself first is spend more time understanding the principles and less time trying to have cool methods from what we're able to read. And I think now we're more gravitated towards methods because that's what's cool, right? Like you pull up Instagram and or the internet and you want to figure out what's the squat method? Like what's a squat cycle I could put this person on, right? What's a muscle up method I could put this on? Well, instead of that, think about, okay, well, what's a principle for building upper body pulling strength, right? What's a principle for building strength to be able to get them to snatch more, clean jerk more, what have you, right? So that's what I tell people to start. Spend more time on truly understanding the different principles of strength and conditioning before you start thinking about methods. And I think that can help them decipher through all the different stuff out there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are sort of stuck in the methods mindset where it's like, maybe a simple illustration of this would be all the people who are sort of mediocre athletes who jump around from all the different group programs, the online training programs out there. Like, oh, like I did this one for a little bit. All right, let's go over to this one and see if they have the secret sauce. And then after another couple months, we'll jump over to this one. It's like, and as like most of the coaches in the space who are more experienced look at all of them, they're like, yeah, they're all like, I mean, they're all different, but they all sort of are, I mean, they're all training CrossFit. Like it's like pretty much the same thing. And it's like, I think that's maybe, that perspective, principles, when you can zoom out a little bit and see, okay, where does this fit into the overall picture? And like, where is this going to be appropriate? And then you can start to give it to the people that is appropriate for the right time. And even if it's a little bit, maybe still a little bit experimentation based because you haven't done it before. And like, that's sort of the nature of it. You can still be responsible in the way that you give it because it's not, I mean, it's something that is still going to be appropriate. It's just a matter of like, how well does it actually work?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I actually see this. So, I mean, I'm sure you and I can go down a rabbit hole here, but like one time I was talking to Matt Bruce. He's the owner of Brew now. And his coach was Hatch. So the Hatch squat cycle, right? The Hatch squat cycle he told me was designed as almost like not a gimmick, but his lifters were so fucking strong that they're like, what are you doing for squats? What's your squat program? So he just like made up some squat program, like, oh, here it is, here's what they do, right? But
Yeah.
And everyone thinks like that's like the magical. No, he just worked on the principle of getting his athletes really, really fucking strong, and they could all snatch and clean jerk a ton of weight, right? And I see a lot of people jumping around methods and methods too much with when they think about like building capacity, because it's a simple concept of increasing stress, and whether it's from volume or intensity, like that doesn't change. And if you look at traditional running programs, like that's what changes. They're not jumping around on all these different methods and protocols every single week. It's runners are going to run and they're going to slowly increase either their volume or their intensity each week, just by a small amount, like gradually building upon it. It's not doing all these different protocols and methods. It's the same, probably mundane shit and method that they're doing based on the same principle of slowly increasing intensity volume for what their sport or distance requires, and that's the biggest thing to say is like it's not fancy, it's not cool, it's just doing the basic shit, the basic stuff, and doing it really well, and just progressively increasing it, right? Progressive overload, no matter what it is, and backing off, allowing time to recover, allowing that adaptation to occur, and then adding a little bit of more, that's what it comes down to. And I think that's what people really got to really dial into.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sort of curious as to some of your perspective as to, where we're at currently in the space, and then where you see the sort of the future of it going in terms of like the volume intensity thing, because obviously like those are the two that people are always weighing against each other. Like they're not technically opposites, but that's, an easy way to think about it. Like, I feel like initially when CrossFit was getting more popular and there was, sort of like the initial wave of it, it was just like max effort all the time and all the metcons. And it was like, just intensity got pushed constantly. And then I feel like at a certain point, like maybe we're kind of in that now, it kind of got pushed the other way where people are understanding that, like volume as like a, sort of a factor to weigh in your training is super important and really potent tool if you use it correctly. And then there's also like, okay, what about like doing your sport or doing easy aerobic? Like there's all these other things that we can start to weigh in, which also impacts that sort of matrix, the volume and intensity. Where do you sort of see us sitting at now as like let's say a competitive community right now? And then where do you think that might go? And is that the right direction if it goes that way?
Good question. So just to reframe the question, from a community standpoint with Inside Training, where do I see us now from a volume and intensity standpoint, correct?
Correct.
And then where do I think that might go? And then is that good or bad?
Right.
Okay. I definitely see it getting more and more intelligent. I think where we're at right now is the best point from a developmental standpoint of where it's been. I think every year that it progresses, coaches get smarter and smarter, new experts come in, and people are. The one thing I'd say about CrossFit, and I used to have this debate a lot, and do you know Eric Cressy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
Eric Cressy and he's the first one that said this to me. He goes, whether you're in another field and you don't think CrossFit is good, the desire to learn and educate within inside the field of CrossFit is one of the best out of anywhere, right? And Eric Cressy first said that to me, and I was like, you're right, because if you go to any seminars, weightlifting, functional movement screening, whatever it might be, probably 50% or more are CrossFit coaches, right? Or some sort of field of that, so the pursuit of learning and is doing things right and doing things better keeps improving and improving. And I think where we're at right now, from conversations I had, there's a better and better understanding of volume intensity and what that means and what's right or wrong, and what is right or wrong from volume intensity. I mean, you and I know that it's all person specific. Like you look at other sports, you look at boxers, you look at MMA guys, you look at runners, you look at rowers. I had to talk with Lindsay Shoup, who's one of the most decorated female rowers in American history. Her race time for rowing was 6 minutes. Like at the Olympics, when they won gold, She was 6 minutes. So I was like, all right, what did you do for training? I want to dive into what her training was. Her training was 2-a-days that lasted 60 to 90 minutes per fucking session with intensity in every single session, 7 days a week. That's fucking volume, right? You're doing one event for 6 minutes and you're doing 2 to 3 hours on the erg with intensity with weight training. Weight training 3 days a week, erg twice a day, 7 days a week. I go, all right, what about intensity? She goes, well, every day we are hitting bouts of intensity. What changed was the length of time. How can I say that that's wrong? They won a fucking gold, right? In the worst conditions ever when they run it and when they won it. So the debate of volume and intensity really is person specific, as we know, but we know that with sport, volume's needed. But what varies is how we all know that volume is also person specific and where they are within inside that sport. I think it's more important to make sure that as we progress with the sport, we properly position people to sustain volume by not cutting corners in the beginning. And that means playing the long game, which is the hardest thing to do in the sport because the shelf life is pretty quick, right? It's not like a 12 to 15 year shelf life. I think females can go a lot longer, but you have to make sure you build your structure and your stability and you have the proper training progressions in a year to be able to progressively build for volume and then back off. And you're not there the whole year round, but it's needed because I remember the first time I tried to do a 50K run. I wasn't training to do a 50K run. I was doing, I was doing the CrossFit endurance program, right? And I got out to like mile 30 and I was like, this fucking shit doesn't work. Because I've never on my feet that long. Like you need volume.
Yeah,
you know? It was like
your structure couldn't handle it.
It couldn't handle it. Who does CrossFit endurance work for? People that have already put in the crazy amounts of volume, and okay, well they don't need it because their body's used to it. So it's needed in sport. You know, you look at basketball players. You have to shoot 1,000 shots a day. That's a ton of volume, right? You look at boxers. You got to do a ton of reps of boxing and movement. That's a ton of volume. But in every sport, what changes is the intensity around the stress on the joints. And I think that's what we have to keep getting more intelligent at, is making sure that we do that properly so we're not ripping apart shoulders and hips, which I think we are. And I think right now, going back to your question, I think we're at a great point where that's really being assessed and progressed really well. The hardest question, I think, to answer is your question of where do I think it can go? And I think that's so hard to answer because there's no parameters around the sport, you know, and because there's no parameters on a sport, it's almost impossible to be like, well, what is the top end that people can sustain? Because think about it, like 5 years ago, it was like 30 ring muscle ups. It was like, all right, you know, people are going to break that up, and 30 ring muscle ups in a workout, like, oh man, it's a lot of muscle ups. Nowadays, like, all right, well, you can't do 30 muscle ups unbroken. Well, you better get better at that. And now it's like, all right, well, now you got to do 50 ring muscle ups with, you know, heavy squat snatches or what have you, right? And where we're taking this sport and the demands of the body, there's no ceiling to it as defined by the organizers of the sport. So it's like, well, if every year it's just getting more demanding and more stress on the body and or more volume, we have to have our athletes ready to sustain that. Because if they've never been there, then they're going to break down once they get there, right? So I think it's going to keep building, and I'm not saying it's wrong at all. Like, look at the sport of running. You know, you have people doing the ultras, it's crazy ultra marathons all the time, and they get it done, and they sustain volume for that. So I think like where the sport's going to go is, I think we're going to keep progressing intelligently with that beautiful symphony of volume and intensity into a way that where the human beings and the body is going to be doing in the sport of fitness is crazy things. And I think it's going to keep progressing every year. And I don't know what those numbers look like. You know, we can only make sure that as coaches, we do our due diligence to make sure that their structure is built for what you want to eventually have them be able to do. And that you understand how to build and then come back and then rebuild the structure, rebalance them, build more, and then come back, you know, and make sure we progress it properly.
Yeah. I mean, basically any capacity-based sport out there, like the people in the sport are building past the functional volume and then tapering back to it so that they can actually express intensity across that volume, whatever the actual tested volume is. Like, I feel like a lot of people in CrossFit still aren't to the place where they can properly express the functional volume because they haven't had the huge volume of contractions backlogged like months and years in the past so that they can actually taper down at the correct level. Like people train up to 105 chest to bars because that's what's in 19.5. They don't train up to, 150 or 200 and then bring it back down to really dense work for 105, for example.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah. So I think it could be really cool. Like in 5 years, like where it gets to, like I'm pretty excited to see what people are doing.
Yeah.
Who knows what's going to happen.
It's really exciting. Like we can complain about how there's not as much structure as there could be or direction in the sport from, a top down perspective. But yeah, I mean, it's the way things are progressing. It's exciting sort of regardless of what specifics go on.
Right. Exactly. And then, yeah. And maybe at some point they'll get to that, maybe they won't as far as like a structural standpoint of testing and testing protocols. And I know some people call for that and some people kind of demand it, but I'm also like, well, they never said that was their idea of their sport. Like they created this sport kind of, and they never once said that was a requirement for it. So I'm like, why should they change it? We just have to keep preparing for what they think. Yeah.
Right. Like literally it's like kind of built into it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Super interesting. Super curious as to where it's going to go. I want to be respectful of your time. So I really appreciate you jumping on today.
Yeah, man, this is great. I appreciate you having me. Thanks for doing it.
Yeah. Catch you later.
Awesome. Thanks, my man.
Hey, it's Ben again. And I wanted to take a minute to talk about our online training program, The Protocol. The Protocol is for athletes who want to train for the sport of fitness. It's programmed by me, and it's my best attempt at preparing athletes with varying strengths and weaknesses for the demands of the sport. And I do this through the use of silos, which basically means I segment parts of the program based upon athletes' ability in a particular area. So for example, an element of the program this fall on Tuesdays and Thursdays was gymnastics-focused training. And there are 4 different silos, so athletes could choose to work on chest bars or muscle-ups or handstand push-ups or handstand walks. In other words, we are all doing the same core program, but there are ways to individualize it on a weekly basis. And as part of the program, I also include coaches' notes, technique videos, and educational resources almost daily. My goal is to not just have this feel like you're doing a workout plan, but to feel like I'm actually coaching you through the process of becoming the best athlete you could be. And having access to the protocol is just part of the benefit of being a pro member. You also get instant access to the Vault, which is exactly like it sounds. It means that you unlock the ability to be able to download all the programs that I've ever written. So this includes things like Bulletproof Body, which is the accessory work for functional fitness, gymnastics density for the Big 5, functional thickness, your first muscle up, cyclical supremacy, overhead squat mobility, breathwork for the sport of fitness, and it could go on and on. And lastly, you get instant access to pro articles, which are on topics that I really want to safeguard from the public and keep for my athletes. Stuff like cycle speeds for CrossFit open movements, strength ratio data analysis, so basically determining your relative weaknesses on strength work, breaking down sanctionals programming or games programming, energy systems testing and analysis, and a whole lot more. And if this sounds like stuff that you're into, you can get a 7-day free trial of Pro. Simply head over to zorfitness.com/pro. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay the course.